All right, hi there. My name is Vikrant Reddy. I'm Senior Fellow for Criminal Justice at Stand Together. In the space of criminal justice, Stand Together is pushing for a criminal justice system that upholds human dignity, that protects public safety, and that pursues equal justice for all. Today we're going to have a conversation about how to do those things through the specific area of drug policy, cannabis policy. I want to start by talking about what this panel is not about. This is not a panel about whether or not we should legalize cannabis. That would have been a good panel in 2002. It's now 2022. Cannabis is, at least for medical purposes, legal in 34 states. It is for recreational purposes legal in 18 different states. The majority of Americans are living under a legal cannabis regime. Representative Mace is trying desperately to get her colleagues in Congress to understand that. But that is where we are right now. We live in that world, so that conversation is not useful. What's a better conversation is to talk about what happens next. All policy decisions involve trade-offs. You get some good, you get some bad. It's complicated. And a smart policymaker, a smart academic would now spend their time thinking about what you do to enhance all the good we get and to mitigate the potential for bad. And I am so fortunate that I happen to have with me today a smart policymaker and a smart academic who are well suited to have this exact discussion. I have Representative Nancy Mace, who has done everything from working as a waitress at Waffle House to being the first ever female graduate of the Citadel. But what she is doing right now is representing the 1st District of South Carolina in the United States House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. I also have Professor Doug Berman from the Ohio State University.
Well done.
He has authored what is probably the leading casebook on marijuana law. He maintains a blog that has actually been cited by the United States Supreme Court on sentencing policy, and the two of them are just fantastic minds on this issue. What I want to do today is start by just asking a couple of really basic questions to get some definitions and factual things down, and then I want to start having that conversation about trade-offs, what's going really well, what we're worried about, what we're doing to mitigate, and let's just have a conversation. Let's let it be a real conversation, not just be a Q&A. Feel free to cut one another off.
Wonderful.
So the first kind of definitional thing, I'm going to turn to you, Representative Mace. People come to me all the time. In fact, members of Congress have asked me, they say, cannabis is legal in my state. Why do we even need a federal bill? Like, what is the point of doing something at the federal level? What is the answer to that question?
Well, educating the member of Congress for starters, right? There's a lot of misinformation about cannabis, which is why I'm trying to lead, at least in the Republican conference, on this issue. But it's needed because, as you stated, so many states have legalized it. And less than 10%, for example, of these businesses that are legally operating in the states that have some form of cannabis or another can't even bank right now. You have Canadian weed stocks that can be on the stock market, stock exchange here in the U.S., but any cannabis company here in the U.S., they have to be on the Canadian exchanges, and so you can't even write off your business taxes if you're a cannabis company. And so there's a need for it to have a framework that would allow for the businesses that are legally operating in those states to be able to operate like any legal business. And I'm going to say it's even higher than that. So there are 47 states. There are only 3 that have absolutely no cannabis reform. So my home state of South Carolina, we have CBD and we have hemp. We are halfway through the process of trying to get medical cannabis there. To the south of South Carolina, you've got Florida. They have medical, obviously, Colorado, California, Oregon, and as 15 other states, total of 18, have adult recreational use. And so every state is different. And so we need the federal government to provide a framework that will allow these businesses to operate legally in the way that they are and have access to loans, to financing, and be treated like any other legally operating business. In this cash business here, it's very dangerous. And some of what we've seen has only enticed and incentivized the black market and the illicit market. And so we need that framework for these businesses to be able to function, make a profit, and do what they're doing and really well across the country.
Okay. And Doug, let me ask you, just during my opening remarks, I think I kind of clumsily went back and forth between saying legalize and decriminalize. Is there a difference between those terms, and what is the difference?
So thank you for that question, and absolutely there's a difference, but it's not clear when people use it if they're always meaning the same thing, and that's been, I think, one of the ongoing challenges why I'm so grateful for the work of Representative Mace, because we need more law here just to clarify things that are in the kind of nomenclature, but people use the terms in different kinds of ways. I try to use the term decriminalization to talk about not having criminal penalties associated with any cannabis activity. The problem with that is some people say, oh, you mean like a parking ticket or a speeding ticket? Well, that's not really decriminalized either. Often people use that meaning, but I think if you get caught for speeding, you don't say, well, it's decriminalized, it's not a big deal. You know, you have a fine, you have other consequences that come with that. I think true decriminalization would be saying there's no criminal penalties whatsoever. Though that's distinct and in many respects different from what I think of legalization meaning, which is you not only have no criminal penalties, but you have some kind of regulatory system, some kind of legal structure to allow businesses to operate. And again, you can think about, maybe we could decriminalize without legalizing, but if you truly decriminalize, if you say there's no criminal sanctions whatsoever for this activity, in a modern capitalist society, people are going to say, great, I want to open a business and I want to move forward with turning this into a consumer product or a medical product. And so they tend to get collapsed that way, right? That if you really are talking about let's get rid of criminal sanctions, you're probably on the path to a kind of full legalization or at least medical legalization. But again, there are some folks, and I really think this is the last point on it, some folks, this is where I came to the issue, they're very worried about the war on drugs, the consequences of the war on marijuana, just the way in which cannabis has been used as a mechanism, particularly to over-police black and brown communities and put all sorts of harm in people's way for flourishing. Those are folks who are like, well, we just need to decriminalize and get that bad part out of the way. But there are a lot of other folks, and I've sort of come to this space as well, that says, yeah, but if we could actually legalize this industry and do it well, it can be a source of jobs, it can be a source of tax income, it can be all sorts of benefits that come from growing a new industry. And so that's where, I think over time we've seen at the local level efforts to decriminalize ultimately tend to expand to legalize and see what we've seen in a number of states, both at the medical level and at the full legalization level, where we have significant job growth, significant industry building around, though still in the shadow of federal prohibition, and that creates all sorts of problems that we'll probably end up talking about.
And I think, too, to add on to that, there's just the nomenclature legalize versus decriminalize. Legalize is a dirty word in some places. They think it's a whole other connotation. And so it's really making sure people who are ignorant or unknowledgeable about what legalize actually means creating a market, putting the regulatory guidelines and guardrails in place for that. But to some people who are anti-cannabis, they try to use the word legalize as to a detriment because they don't understand, they're ignorant and uneducated on the issue. And so what I've tried to do, and I know Professor Berman as well, we're trying to educate people on what does that actually mean. And that's what my bill, the States Reform Act, I think really provides that framework to be able to do both and do it well.
The subject of medical use has come up a lot, and I want to get even more specific. There's a lot of conversation about how legal cannabis could be particularly good for veterans' health. What are people talking about? What do they have in mind there? You know a thing or two about this, Representative Mace.
And I have this bill. It's called the States Reform Act, and if you want to tweet about it, it's hashtag States Reform Act today. It would be really great. But I unveiled it in November, and it's a comprehensive cannabis reform bill that allows states to have the right to do what they're already doing in 47 to 50 states legally, providing a federal excise tax, the regulatory framework for the federal government to get out of the way and allow states to have the driver's seat and make these decisions for themselves and not be pressured one way or another by the federal government. And so, but within that bill, I have special provisions, medical provisions, particularly for veterans, because I come from a family of vets. Most of my family, my dad retired from the Army after 28 years. I have family that are deployed right now on the border of Ukraine. I have other family members that are on standby. And I sit on the Veterans Affairs Committee in Congress. And so veterans issues are really important. But when you talk to vets who have PTSD and you hear the benefits where they are able to take some form of THC legally where they live, the incidences of suicide going down, the incidence of them getting addicted to other drugs is gone down, and the data is there. I'm sure we'll get into it today, but the statistics is there to show that cannabis can save lives. And in fact, I told this story when I unveiled my States Reform Act in November of last year. But in addition to being a waitress at the Waffle House and the first woman to graduate from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, I actually am a high school dropout. I was raped when I was 16 by a classmate of mine in high school, and I refused. I couldn't go back to school. And I had some really tough times, and my doctor prescribed me antidepressants. Well, the antidepressants made my depression, my feelings of depression, actually worse. And I didn't want to live any longer. So I stopped taking the prescription drugs that I was given, and I started doing cannabis for a period of time in my life. And it cut my anxiety, it helped me sleep at night, it got me through some very difficult times. And by the time a couple months later after that, and I dropped out of school at that time, and my parents said, if you're gonna stop going to school, you gotta start going to work. Well, that's what got me through the day, and that's what got me to be a survivor of that very traumatic event in my life. So when I talk to veterans, I can feel that pain because I've been through that pain before, and it's personal for me. And it literally saved my life, and I know that it can save other lives too. And so I have protections in there for veterans in my bill, specifically if you are a veteran and you get it prescribed medical cannabis from your doctor at the VA, anywhere in the country, you would be protected, and you wouldn't be discriminated against for using when you apply for a job, et cetera. And so I also have protections in there for people who have HIV and AIDS or sickle cell anemia or arthritis or dying of cancer and terminally ill. And so those protections are really important when we're talking about the medical side of it. And that's one of the reasons we need to decriminalize it, deschedule it, and to deschedule it, you have to decriminalize it so we can study it for medical reasons. I mean, there are journal articles in the Journal of American Medicine from decades ago about the benefits of it, but we need to study it even more to truly know what it can do. There are studies out there now that say that it can reduce the incidences of acquiring COVID-19, or that when you get COVID-19, it helps in the outcomes of COVID-19. And so you can't do that when it's a Schedule I drug. And so there's a whole domino effect of things that we have to do. But veterans are first and foremost in my mind, and they are protected within my bill. And then within my bill, I also have, in terms of funding, there's funding to protect veterans from a medical standpoint as well. I was very thoughtful about it because there's such a huge need because of the suicide rate. And there have been studies that have shown how effective it is at preventing veterans from committing suicide and a number of other ailments as well.
You know, Doug.
I was just going to jump in on this because I think, and Representative Mace mentioned this towards the end, but it's worth emphasizing over and over and over again. The need for federal reform starts and goes incredibly hard forward on the medical research front. We've, cannabis was used as a medicine hundreds of years ago. There's a whole, sort of worldwide history of a range of doctors trying different parts of the cannabis plant for medical purposes. It had a rich history, and then it just got stopped in its tracks once federal prohibition came along, because once something's on Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act, once it's illegal that way, no big pharma or even little pharma can get access to the drug legally to do experiments, to do the range of testing and the review of opportunities that the plant might provide. And so what we know is it's not quite anecdotal. We have lots of observational studies. There's lots of research that Representative Mace referenced that show lots of promise. But to turn that promise into consistent, good medical products is going to take more research, just like we're very confident with through both at the federal and state level, the opportunity to move forward and produce remedies for a range of issues that have been challenging. But while federal prohibition is in place, there's barriers to funding, barriers to actually doing the research. All that gets in the way. The other part that I'd emphasize, especially vis-a-vis veterans, that has broken my heart for all the time I've been studying this, is it's not just that veterans aren't being prioritized. It's actually they're put behind average citizens when it comes to access to medical marijuana. Right now, in many states that don't require doctors to get any special license before they recommend medical marijuana, Oklahoma is the one that I think about a lot, where any doctor can recommend to any patient that cannabis may help their condition, and then they can access medical cannabis throughout the state, unless you're a veteran going to the VA and your doctor is a Veteran Administration doctor, because they are prohibited, because of federal prohibition, from recommending to a veteran that they even consider using the medical cannabis that everybody else in the state has access to through their regular doctor. And so, we talk about supporting the troops, but we have a law in place right now that essentially says, sorry, you've served this country, you don't get to have the same rights and opportunities that your fellow citizens get, because federal prohibition stands in the way of the doctors that we provide to veterans providing access to medical marijuana on equal terms.
And the States Reform Act brings parity to that. But in addition to that, when you're talking about medical uses for it, there are studies out there and we need more of them. And when I'm pitching my bill to Republicans and Democrats alike, I want to take data to them. Well, you're going to know this, one of the best data points that I have in states that have an opioid epidemic, where you have one dispensary for medical cannabis, the rate of addiction and opioids, the rate of morbidity from opioid addiction drastically is reduced between 17 and 20%, just one dispensary alone. And so this actually can save lives. And I just don't understand, like, why haven't we done this yet? And so that's why I'm working really hard to try to take some common sense to Congress, because it's lacking. But this has real meaning. It makes a real difference in people's lives and can prevent so many awful and worse things from happening to individuals across the board, veterans and non-veterans alike.
You know, just this week, I spoke with somebody who used to lead the DEA, and he said to me, you legalize it folks are overstating the lack of access to research. All you do is apply for a waiver. They're quite frequently granted as long as they come from academic institutions. It's not that hard. Who's overstating their case, us or him?
Well, for sure, it's not that easy. And in fact, the product that you get when you're doing that medical research is you got to get it from Mississippi, right? There's only one place that you can source it from. And so it is prohibitive. When you study it the way that we want to, you have to deschedule it.
Yeah.
Having broad investment in research and R&D into doing that and doing the kinds of medical studies, broad medical studies that we need, you have to deschedule it. And to deschedule it, you then have to decriminalize it because of the way our laws are written in the Constitution. That's how this works. And also, you've got to have interstate commerce when you do that. So there's just this whole domino effect of things that have to happen when you do it, to do it right, to stand up in court, which is why I filed this bill, the States Reform Act, and I'm working very hard to advocate for it and work with people on both sides of the aisle to show that we're going to do this, and this is the path to doing it that makes the most sense.
And I'll even add in, you know, that path that exists today, that whoever was speaking to you said, you know, hey, you can get a waiver and you can go through all those, jump through those hoops and get access to lousy
cannabis.
state-grown cannabis to try to start an experiment. You know, for starters, that waiver system took years early on, and it was only because the states came along, legalized medical marijuana, legalized adult use marijuana, that the federal government finally said, oh, I guess we better allow some more experiments going on here. So it's not just that there was one very narrow path, it's still very cumbersome, it's still expensive, but again, thinking about how research gets done in this country, and it's important not to lose sight of having capital, people thinking, I'll profit from getting this drug approved and developed and available and marketed effectively. The reality of cannabis being prohibited always meant that venture capital and big pharma and all of those didn't even want to even think about going through those steps, right? So it's not just, oh, there was a path. It's understanding that that path is so narrow and so not supported by the kinds of culture of innovation that is what partially makes our country so great, right? That we, you know, let everybody out there come up with an idea and work hard and raise money and try on their own to turn it into a great idea. Again, if it was a cannabis idea, forget it. And again, I think another greatness of our country is the states ultimately got so tired of that, you know, starting with California, but then spreading across the country when it was obvious that there was more to do here, and that's bubbled up to the federal level and you know, allows somebody like Representative Mace to try to encourage her colleagues to get with the program, but it takes a while and it's challenging.
It's been a very long, very painful, very harmful and expensive war on a plant. And let's not forget, the reason these prohibitions were done way back when was because, as our federal government and agents of the federal government said, they wanted to go into black and brown communities and raid those communities and arrest those people who didn't look like the rest of the country. And so, again, another reason why it's past time that the federal government get on board with what states have been doing for more than 2 decades now, and 47 of 50 states have some form of cannabis reform in there.
You know, another reason that we prohibited the substance is that we were told, the argument was made that it would protect public safety. And I want to actually give this question to you, Doug, because we have some evidence now. We have all these states that have legalized it for recreational purposes. Has crime gone up? Has crime gone down? What is the connection between cannabis and crime?
It's a terrific question, and one that I have to say we're still trying to figure out, right? And that, you know, the good news is there were all these predictions, especially when Colorado came on board as the first state to legalize and have retail sales oh, crime's going to go up threefold there. It's going to be this just disaster. You know, the prohibitionist story of, oh, access to cannabis leads to crime made all of these grand assertions about how terrible it was going to be, and pretty much nothing changed. In fact, you can find some studies, and there are studies on kind of on this question, but still developing because we're still so early in kind of the era, particularly of full legalization, where crime seems to go down in certain regions, and then, well, maybe it goes up a little bit over here, depending on what kind of crime you're looking at. Different studies show different things, but the message that I take away and then I deliver to my students is it really hasn't moved the needle that much at all, except, and this is the except that I want to emphasize in the context of crime and my own work in the criminal justice system, we've seen, it's taken a while, but we've seen a dramatic drop in overall cannabis arrests. That's where you could, if you say, what's the biggest thing that happens when you fully legalize? In those jurisdictions, the number of cannabis arrests go down dramatically. And my sense is that actually is a significant public safety benefit. And there's a bunch of dimensions to that, right? One is just unnecessary encounters between police and citizens. Not a great thing. We have lots of evidence of that in recent vintage, so I won't emphasize that point. But freeing up police resources to work on other matters, right? That, you know, that's one of the things. I had a friend who came to speak to my class about his experience in rural Ohio. And he just basically said, I got tired as a police officer chasing around my high school buddies in fields in rural Ohio. It was just a waste of time. It just seemed like a terrible waste. There were bigger problems in our community, and yet that was sort of the simple thing to do to try to think you were doing something, you know, on the beat when in fact it wasn't achieving anything at all. So being able to take resources, law enforcement certainly that extends to court resources, prison resources, and put it instead toward other more important and significant ways of keeping our community safe. And then last but not least, and I think this is the part that takes a long time to play out, but I'm quite optimistic as we see arrest rates go down, involvement in the criminal justice system tends to be criminogenic. Actually, some of the earlier panels, if anybody was here for that, about how whether it's the experience of getting arrested, whether it's the experience of being prosecuted, whether it's the experience of serving time in jail or prison, that doesn't make it more likely that you'll stay on the straight and narrow, especially if you're grumpy, as is often the case, that, wow, why did I get arrested? I know all my high school friends who just happen to be a little bit wealthier or something like that, they're doing this exact same thing and they're not in trouble. That actually fuels a distrust of the system, fuels a bunch of other criminogenic forces. So I think we're going to get long-term public safety dividends from the downcline in arrests in this respect. Are they there quite yet? Can we measure them quite yet? No, we had this thing called a pandemic and all sorts of other stuff going on. So it's really hard because in many respects, you know, this is such a small piece of a broader public safety question, but the data we see and the data we can be most confident about, the reduction in cannabis arrests, I think ultimately ends up being a public safety win.
Yeah, and cannabis arrests that disproportionately affect black and brown communities. You're 4 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis if you're not white. And so that disparity, when you go through this process and have these reforms and decriminalize it and legalize it, then you're bringing greater parity, which is for the greater good as well. And we worked on the States Reform Act for about 9 months. And I talked to local law enforcement and sheriffs and deputies and police chiefs, et cetera. And they're not arresting, even in my home state, they are not arresting for small, for small uses or small amounts of marijuana or cannabis when they do pull someone over or have an issue. They're not doing that. They have much bigger fish to fry, and they understand that and are largely supportive of these kinds of reforms because they see the data shows that by and large data I've seen, crime does not go rampantly increase, and in fact, you're bringing greater parity to an issue that disproportionately affects black and white people in great margins. So,
You know, Doug, you're talking about reducing the number of unnecessary arrests, and I couldn't help but think about Eric Garner, the man who, in New York City, a police officer came to have a conversation with him, and that conversation did not go well. He was put in a chokehold. He ultimately died. And why did the police officer want to have a conversation with him? Because he was selling loose cigarettes on the side of the road, which is illegal in New York. And cannabis is obviously illegal in a lot of places. How many unnecessary conversations between police officers and people take place and then just go in a very, very bad direction?
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, it's funny because when you talk about Eric Gardner, I use that with my students to highlight the fact that even when we do fully legalize marijuana at the federal level, across the country, there's still going to be a criminal justice footprint in cannabis enforcement, right? Because tobacco is obviously legal everywhere, and yet you sell it the wrong way. And of course, that's one of the things that I think is an ongoing challenge to even measuring how much of an impact we're having. This was a Colorado story that was concerning, talk about problematic police-citizen encounters. The data out of Colorado, the first state to legalize, was a dramatic decrease, as I mentioned, in adult arrests for cannabis, but actually a significant and quite disturbing and quite racially disparate increase in youth arrests. And part of that story is, and part of why it's so important to kind of do this the right way, is I think a lot of police officers, a lot of community school police thought, oh my goodness, cannabis is everywhere now that it's legal. We got to really crack down in the schools and make sure the kids aren't bringing this in, and we're going to double check their backpacks. And you know what? The kids probably had just the same amount of cannabis in their backpacks before as they did after legalization, but now there was this kind of intense focus on, well, it's legal for this group, so we have to even crack down harder on the groups that it's illegal for, or again, if you're selling it the wrong way, or if your licensing isn't exactly right. And I think that's one of the, for me, broader stories that, again, I think came up in an earlier panel about the war on drugs. We've got to just move away, I think, entirely from a criminalization mindset, right? And we've actually seen this even in some of the state cannabis bills, where it's like, oh, we're going to have licensing in place so you can have a legal business, and we're going to double the fines or put in all these incredible sanctions if you don't do your paperwork the right way. And and that seems like, well, that's good. We're safeguarding the legitimate industry. It's like, yeah, but you're still bringing a punitiveness to this arena that is going to fundamentally not just disserve the people who want to get into this business, but continue to perpetuate this sort of stigma and myth that, oh my God, if there's a loose cigarette, whether it's cannabis or tobacco, that we don't make sure we keep in control, the whole society is going to crumble. And I think that's really where you were talking about people not being educated on these issues. That's where I think there's just so much more education to do to just break away from the kind of criminalization model. Not just because we know the harms of criminalization, but because it's a plant. And if we develop it and use it right, it can be this incredible resource rather than this incredible source for tension and bad encounters between police and individuals.
And kids have access to it already. Like, I was 16 getting it illegally in the state of South Carolina, and actually just literally 2 days ago got a call from a parent of one of my kids' friends who has been buying it, and we're trying to figure out where the child is getting it from. They can't even drive, so how are they? So kids already have access to it. Now it's really a matter of educating our kids on what not to do and not use it when you're in middle school or high school, but they already have access to it. So the war on drugs when it comes to cannabis in our youth has not been effective, and I'm seeing this in my real life. I grew up, I saw it in my life, my personal life, and now I'm seeing it with my kids, and we have these very frank conversations about it because they're in middle school and high school, but they're seeing it. They're seeing kids come into school high in the mornings before they go off to school. And it's just it's a matter of educating our children and educating parents, educating lawmakers on what policies work and don't work. And in this case, clearly the war on drugs, the war on cannabis, the war on a plant has not been effective.
Representative Mace, I want to ask you about taxes. It's kind of common to hear people say, oh, we should legalize it and tax it and get the revenue. And you can say that in the abstract, but what should the tax be? And it's actually a complicated question, because if a tax on anything is too high, then you just create black markets in that thing. And what we're trying to do is end the black markets in cannabis. So people have to get more specific. What should the tax on cannabis be? Should it be levied by the state or federal government? What are your thoughts on how to tax it?
It's actually both. And so my bill, the States Reform Act, allows states to do what they want to do and are already doing, but at the federal level, there are plans out there like Senator Schumer's plans and others, and they want to tax it upwards of 25%. And then if you were to do that at the federal level and then take it to a state like Oregon that has a 19% tax rate, which is still way too damn high, you're going to literally guarantee people getting it off the street and getting it illegally, and God knows what's laced with it. I'm reading stories about fentanyl now laced in all these cannabis products that people are getting off the street, which you don't want to have happen because you could die, your kid could die too. But you want the tax to be very, very low. So in the States Reform Act and the research that we did in the 9 months that it took us to draft this bill, is the studies that we saw said between 3 and 4.75% was really the sweet spot for a federal excise tax to ensure that when it was levied down to the states, that it wouldn't intentionally add on and make taxes so high that you're going to literally guarantee a black market. And so at the federal level, they need to remain very, very low. And you're still talking about $1.5 billion to $2 billion in revenue, up to $5 billion because of the way that the cannabis industry is growing. It is a revenue stream that we are leaving on the table right now that at the federal level, but then at the state level, states can levy their own. Again, this is, my bill is a states' rights bill, a federalism bill, but states would be able to do what they want to do. But states are going to have to give some of this up because when I look and see at some of the implementation in places like California and Oregon, where they're not keeping really good track of who's legal and who's not, and the taxes are so high, you are literally guaranteeing people buying it off the street and buying bad product off the street as well. And it's dangerous, but they've encouraged the black market, the illicit markets, and so you want taxes to remain low. And in some cases, I was reading an article, I think it was on Forbes this week or somewhere else, that in some states where they're selling less cannabis and selling way more alcohol, but the revenue from the cannabis is far higher than the alcohol revenue. And so there needs to be some parity there to ensure that we create an abundant source of legal markets and not illicit markets.
So, Doug, in fairness, I once said to you, we were having a conversation, and I said, inevitably, very high taxes lead to illicit markets. And you said, well, I question the premise. And what you said was really interesting, so why don't you question the premise in public now?
Do you want to elaborate?
Wonderful, absolutely. My pleasure, absolutely. And I want to actually, nerd out for as long as you'll let me on this frontier, because the center that I run at The Ohio State University, it's called the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, and I encourage everybody to go there. We have a lot of really interesting research and resources related to marijuana legalization at the state level and the debate, particularly it's going on intensely in Ohio these days, as we might have an initiative, and we are also looking at federal issues. And we actually did a whole 2 hours, almost 2 hours, on how should cannabis be taxed. And we had the nation's leading experts talking about it. And it's even more complicated and intricate than you might think. But I think the theme of I'm not worried about overtaxation, though I always worry about overtaxation, is I think there's a huge demand for a better product than is there on the street. It's going to take a while for people to realize that. But fundamentally, and this is I often use alcohol analogs on this, in this setting, people pay $5 at a restaurant, sometimes $10 for a beer, when there's no doubt they could get it much cheaper on the quote-unquote illicit market, depending on how you want it. They could actually get it much cheaper just going to the supermarket. But it's a culture of consumption that facilitates a willingness to buy these kinds of products because they're actually so connected for so many people, and I think cannabis will fit the same space, with socialness, with happiness, with a whole bunch of things that are sort of ingrained in our, maybe hardwired into our brain to kind of connect with other people through having a drink, having a meal, for lots of people, for enjoying THC. And so, yes, absolutely, and I'm especially respectful of Representative Mace's bill, because I think actually at the federal level, keeping taxes low is critical so that we can have the laboratory of states explore this exact issue. Some states may want really high taxes to see where that takes them, both to figure out, does that not only allow an illicit market to stay more vibrant, although I really do think over time the illicit market's going to shrink more and more, and ironically, if there's fentanyl in supply, it's going to shrink that much faster because people will realize, oh gosh, from just a product safety perspective, I'd rather pay a little bit more to get it from a dispensary, to get it from a regulated source. But I also just think that once we get a culture that drives forward how to use this product responsibly, people are going to be willing to pay a little bit more. I don't want to go quite so far, and I've got two Gen Z daughters who, are thoughtful consumers, always thinking about, what's the moral thing to do when I go purchase. And I think there's a whole generation that's going to say, if I'm going to that store, I'm willing to pay a little bit more if they're putting that money back into the community, working on social equity issues, which is a big part of the cannabis debate, working toward doing cannabis growth in an environmentally responsible way. I think people are willing to pay that premium. And again, I say that because I know I'm going to overpay for a beer at the airport later tonight because that's just how we ended up creating a marketplace in these kinds of substances. In addition, and I want to emphasize this point as well, I do think actually having somewhat higher prices, there's a lot of this in the tax literature generally, does cut down on problematic use, at least at the margins. It does tend to reduce kid use at the margins, although again, this evidence comes from tobacco and alcohol, where we don't have robust illicit markets that we're sort of building a new industry on top of. But I do think this is likely to be a little bit more of a transitional problem, but again, we all live in the transition, so it could be 10 or 15 years, but I think over time, a bill like Representative Mace's that sets a federal floor and then allows states to explore kind of the way they want to balance that. And here, I'll throw a last point in. I don't want just states to explore. I want states and different localities to have the ability to explore that, right? If Austin wants to have a different tax rate for cannabis because they want to devote it to scholarships for kids to go to UT, and I guess I should do Dallas and SMU, right? And Dallas wants a different tax rate to support kids going to SMU, great for them, right? I mean, I think that's what a sophisticated and thoughtful tax structure will do. It'll bring the power back down to the people in communities to figure out how can we responsibly enable this product to be a good for our community when for so long, again, whether it's you're worried about addiction, you're worried about the harms of cannabis or just the harms of criminalization, this has been a source of stress rather than benefit.
And the government closest to the people is the government governs best. Beauty of what I'm trying to do is allow states to be able to do that.
My big takeaway from that is that we simply have no culture of cannabis. There's no thought put into what is a responsible, serious culture like we have for alcohol. If I say, Nancy, Doug, let's get together tonight at 8 and have a beer, you guys would say, that sounds fine. If I say, let's get together tomorrow morning at 8 and have a beer, you would say, Vikrant, you might have a problem. And of course, it's the same thing in a medical, physiological sense, but we all know culturally that one of those things is acceptable, one is not. And because cannabis is prohibited, we haven't been allowed to develop serious, thoughtful, reasonable cultures around it.
No, that's right. And a lot of misinformed, uneducated, ignorant people on the issue. So
Right.
It's great. Why this panel is so great to be able to help spread the word about how good it'll be for states in our country to get it done.
Well, and I also want to emphasize, and this is a part that is the challenge of culture in the cannabis space, but it plays out a variety of different ways. The culture's largely been driven by heavy users and folks who aren't that committed, whether it's the illicit sellers or a variety of other folks involved in the space, in creating a responsible, I don't want to quite say temperate, but just fully formed, sensible approach to the use of this drug, right? I mean, again, I don't want to say it in a way that's impolite, but imagine if all of our alcohol culture was driven by the heaviest drinkers, right? What if all of our gambling culture was driven by the heaviest gamblers? It would be understandable. We'd be like, ooh, that looks kind of scary and not something that we ought to be supporting. But of course, because we've had these things legalized and folks can know, oh, I can actually bet on March Madness and that won't ruin my life. I can go have a drink with Vikrant either at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. and that's not going to be the end of everything. You don't get the same kind of stigma and the development there. And again, that's what I think that we're starting to get to. And again, this is where I think the medical marijuana frontier really got us going on that, where it was like, wow, this plant can be used to improve people's lives in a way that other drugs hadn't. And that helped people to start understanding, oh, it's not all just that culture of wake and bake or whatever it is that can risk misuse. And then the irony, of course, and I want to emphasize this point in this context, especially never losing sight of what the CDC has said is 100,000 deaths from overdose from other drugs. Cannabis is never that, right? The irony particularly here is the heavy users of cannabis actually still don't have a lot of the problems the heavy users of alcohol, the heavy users of gambling, certainly the heavy users of other drugs are. And so this is, in fact, a remarkably benign plant, all things considered, especially if we can push forward that culture of more responsible use and then also opening up markets to allow us to see all the possibilities the plant creates.
And transforming, Dad, onto that's kind of funny story, transforming on that culture. My parents are about 80, and my father is like, he doesn't like that I'm doing the States Reform Act, but he uses, but Dad, I use CBD oil for your back pain. I'm like, come on, right? But then my mother, who's 80, she's like, if I ever get sick, ship in the best stuff from California that you can, right? And so it is a matter of educating, and generations are getting there, but it's kind of funny to see my parents over time, really kind of come around on that issue. But it is going to take, culturally, it will take time getting out. Wake and bake, like the way that you said that too. More serious uses for cannabis across the board.
I want to get into kind of a wonky academic debate, and I think that even though you are the academic, Doug, Representative Mace, you probably have the better answer to this question. So let me describe the discussion. It's about alcohol and marijuana, and academics are wondering, do people smoke marijuana instead of drinking alcohol, or do they drink alcohol while smoking marijuana? Because if it's the first thing, that's probably good, because you have more cannabis, but you have less drinking. Less drinking means less liver disease, less domestic violence, less of all kinds of things. If it's the latter, that's arguably a bad thing, because people are drinking more and you get all of that. And I don't think we have a good answer as to whether or not it's getting to be more drinking or less drinking. But it occurs to me that the alcohol lobby is probably coming to your office and asking for meetings, and I wonder what they're saying in those meetings. Are they saying that they support your efforts, they're skeptical of your efforts? What are you hearing from them?
I hear from lots of lobbyists that try to get in the office. They try to get those meetings, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. It's hard to say that data doesn't exist, what's going on, but anecdotally, I do hear about, moms trying to get off the evening wine and doing a half a gummy at night as opposed to doing a glass of wine. Anecdotally, you hear some of that, or, I have a friend who's addicted to Ambien and is trying to do gummies at night to get off of Ambien to get rid of that addiction. And she's a mom of 2 kids too. And so anecdotally you hear about some of that. But as far as the alcohol lobby, we've heard from them a little bit. But I think that the alcohol industry, for some of them, they want to get into the cannabis industry. And so my bill, the States Reform Act, treats cannabis like alcohol. So but I hear about retailers that are trying to get into it. You hear about mom and pop shops. You hear about big alcohol distributors that are want to get into the space. And so it's sort of this interesting thing. Nobody wants competition, but competition is good for the market, right? Large and small. But then at the same time, there's this anti-cannabis movement among lobbyists, but then there's this sort of pro-alcohol lobby that, hey, they want to be a part of this too. They want to get in on the game because it is going to be a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so if you're in business, you're looking at it from that perspective too. So I would say it's really been a mix of folks. But more importantly than that, I will sometimes have members of Congress. Well, what does the alcohol lobby think? Or what does the alcohol distributor in my state or my district, what do they think of the bill? And then we got to go back and try and figure out what that perspective is, and then come back and refute, something that's going on there to try and get those people to get support for the bill. And so there is some of that machination that goes on as the sausage is getting made. But by and large, I think it's sort of a mix. Some are pro, some are anti. But same thing in the cannabis industry. Surprisingly, there are some institutions of cannabis that have been out there for a couple of years that don't want the federal government to actually come in and do any sorts of reforms because they like the game they're in. They like the monopoly that they have.
Right,
they don't want the competition. And so I actually, ironically and surprisingly, have been shocked by that. And when I did my States Reform Act, I had like 8 Republicans that were going to sign on to my bill, original co-sponsors. That was like on a Friday. I was announcing the bill on a Monday. By Monday, I had 5. It had dropped to 5 because certain cannabis lobbyists had come in and gotten 2 or 3 members and pulled them out of it because they didn't want it to be done. Okay, so there's this tribal thing going on that's also very interesting and shocking. And so now we're going back to the wheelhouse and saying, okay, what amendments do you want to do? What do you want to see in it? We're trying to negotiate on the back end to make it a better bill so we can get everybody on board, alcohol, all of cannabis, and get everyone on board the thing. It's been actually surprising. And then, some of the folks that you're going to see, Democrats are going to pass the MORE Act again out of the House. They're going to do the Banking Act, Safe Banking Act, for like the 6th or 7th time in the next couple weeks. And then Schumer may or may not actually even file a bill. And those bills, all those things I just mentioned, are going to fail in the Senate. The only man left standing, the only game in town, will be the States Reform Act, which is why I'm working so hard to figure out where everybody is and how do we get there, how do we ensure we get the right data, the right studies to show these folks this is how to do it safely, and how to do it economically. I have expungement and release in my bill at the federal level. It doesn't touch states. States can do what they want on social equity. They can do what they want on expungement and release. But on my bill, I pitched to Republicans and Democrats alike. It affects 2,600 nonviolent inmates, non-cartel gang members, non-DUI. And oh, by the way, it saves the federal government and our prison system $600 million over 5 years. I don't know a single Republican that's not going to like that. And then, of course, Democrats like the expungement and release side of it. I call it safe expungement and release. But there's some work to do even, but we're getting a lot of support, tremendous support, even from places in the alcohol industry, because they want in on it too.
They want in. Doug, do you have thoughts on whether cannabis is a competitor to alcohol or a complement to alcohol?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely can be either or both. And I think one of the things I find so fascinating and so challenging about doing work in this space is I don't think we have any real concrete idea where the cannabis market could be headed. And a lot of that will turn on which federal reform model ends up dominating. I think tax stories will dominate. I don't know if we're going to talk about THC levels at some point, but
Talk about it now.
okay.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think is so interesting, especially when you compare the sort of the alcohol to cannabis issue, is when we say alcohol, we actually mean a bunch of different things, right? We mean beer. Okay, we mean wine. That's really different, both in terms of how it's produced and marketed and the cultures in which we consume it. And then we have what we typically call hard alcohol. And among other things, I'll kind of highlight the part that hard alcohol is actually a relatively new phenomenon. We only sort of learned how to distill regularly in a commercially producible way for about 100 years. And people who really understand public health stories about alcohol say, oh, boy, that was a big mistake. That it was really the hard alcohol, and especially the availability of hard alcohol in the home that has driven the bulk of problem drinking and the sort of the harms that go along with that. And that's a culture story too, that if you look in Europe, you look in some other cultures even today, most of your drinking is done in social settings, at restaurants, at pubs. There's much less drinking in the home in some other countries than we have here in the US, and that plays a role in sort of the problem. And so that has a bunch of layers to it, right? That means, wow, if people substitute at home cannabis for hard alcohol, that would probably be great, and probably most people will do it that way, because when they're consuming in the home on their own, they're doing it for the effect. And that may be just fine, because in that respect, cannabis is probably safer than alcohol, and people are likely to do that. But in a social setting, especially if cannabis is available in bars where alcohol is also available, I think you're going to see a lot of supplementation rather than substitution. I don't think people will go to the bar and be like, well, I'm just having cannabis drinks tonight. They may have both, or I don't even know what White Claw is exactly, but there'll be the White Claw.
Had one at lunch.
Right. There'll be the cannabis White Claw, and they'll be like, you want the cannabis version, or you want this? So where the products will go will itself, and the market will determine this, the laws will determine this, but culture will really drive a lot of what we end up being substituting or supplementing. At the end of the day, I'm not too concerned about supplementing if most people are consuming relatively low alcohol, which is really beer and wine rather than hard liquor, and most people are consuming relatively low THC marijuana products, because the evidence seems to be, and I'm not the scientist here, but I know what I read, at lower level THCs, under 10%, the health risks to the developing brain for younger people for long-term use seem much, much less than the high THC products. And of course, that makes some sense, right? If somebody was drinking an entire bottle of hard alcohol every day, we'd be much more worried about them if they were just drinking a beer every day. And so I think it's not just a question of does it substitute or supplement, it's what are the products that people are regularly using them, what are the environments they're using them. People who know a lot more than me about drug use and drug harms talk about set and setting, that your drug experience is going to be much different depending on the set you come in thinking about when you use the drug and the setting in which you're doing that. And again, this is where, with all due respect to the lawmakers, all due respect to the academics, it's going to be all of you. It's going to be the people who define culture and move us forward in this space that are going to ultimately help us either mitigate the potential harms of either alcohol or cannabis, or I hope maximize the benefits. But it's a collective work for all of us to do, and it's a very unpredictable story, which makes it exciting, but I can understand why for some people it's very scary. If you want to look at what could go wrong, that's not crazy to be worried. High THC levels, heavy use, people supplementing with hard alcohol and all sorts of other drugs, but that doesn't have to be our future. And in fact, I think it's very unlikely that it would be, especially if we have great lawmakers putting forward good bills.
And that's why labeling is so important. I love a good Lambrusco. It's like 5% alcohol. It's like grape juice with just a little bit. But that's why labeling is so important. But you've seen it with hard alcohol too, or any alcohol. I mean, if you're going to do it to excess, you're going to do it to excess and do things you shouldn't do. The same thing would be with anything, everything in moderation, right? And if you go overboard on any product, it's going to have a bad outcome. And so adults have to be responsible for the decisions that they make and what they consume and be held accountable to that.
So it looks like we've got about 10 minutes left. So let's turn to Q&A in just a moment. Start generating questions. I want to ask one quick thing because talking about different kinds of alcohol made me think of something. There are different ways you can, well, you're allowed to advertise when it comes to different kinds of alcohol. Like with beer, do what you want. Turn on any football game, there's 100 beer commercials. Hard liquor, it's much more tightly regulated. With cigarettes, it's extremely tightly regulated how you advertise for it. So there's a spectrum here. Where on that spectrum should cannabis advertising be?
I think it'll be a mix. And in my particular bill, it'll be up to the states to determine the labeling outcome on how they want to handle the product. Again, I think having states in the driver's seat, having the control to make these decisions is going to have the best outcome for every state and that sort of thing. And so I'm going to leave it up to the states to make that decision because they're already in and out of regulations. They do it for alcohol, they do it for cigarettes, they do it for e-cigarettes. They're already there doing it. This is just supplementing what they're already doing, allowing them to be in the driver's seat to make those decisions for consumers in their states where any form of it is legalized, where you're talking about CBD or hemp or medical or full adult use.
And I'd say, I think THC levels, from my understanding of the science, is an important factor in how we differentiate products. And that'll be very important, not just to have clear labeling, but have different access rules or, I tend not to like heavy restrictions, but I think if people just think about, oh, I want to get some cannabis, and they don't know whether they're getting essentially the beer or the hard liquor, that's a big problem.
Right.
And that advertising restrictions, maybe place of purchase restrictions, right? I mean, cigarettes, you got to kind of go to the counter and say, can I have that rather than have it out, both concerned about youth access and just to create one more kind of bit of friction before people can get access to certain products. I think that's going to be valuable and important. They've done a little bit of this in Colorado, just sort of one example. Some of you may be familiar with this. Edibles were a big challenge right at the early stages of legalization because it's very hard to know actually how much THC is in an edible, especially if you're just doing a cookie and the amount of cannabis can sort of mix around in the cookie and you want to sell it for a lot, so you make it a big cookie, and then people were having challenges with that, and they developed regulations that ensured that for an edible product, it can't have more than this amount of cannabis in each of the edibles. Now you can buy a container of 10 of those, but that just allows for effective consumer choice. And I think, again, that's where, you were mentioning, I was going to joke, Representative Mace, it's like, yes, labeling's important. Everybody's illicit dealer has great labeling on their baggies, right? That's where I think I get back to this idea that if we do this right, people are going to be very keen to go into the lawful store, buy this product, at a slightly bigger premium, but because they know they're getting consistent stuff that they can have a consistently good experience with, just like we do with alcohol right now, just like can be the case with a variety of other products in a similar vein. And so I'm hoping advertising can contribute to that, right? That the one part of the story will be, if you have a lot of access to hearing about the low THC product, that looks interesting and exciting. I want to try that, but I'm not sure I'm going to want to see advertising, hey, good news, we've got the most THC. In fact, there was a big debate among the public health community. Apparently, in California, somebody was trying to run at the state fair who could make the highest THC product. And the public health folks were like, what do we do? Like, that's just nuts to have a prize for who can make the highest THC product, because that's the stuff that poses the most risk. And I think we got to be
the Everclear of cannabis.
Yes, exactly. There you go.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Obviously, the amount of THC that's in a product, but again, it goes back to we need to deschedule it so we can research it and study it and know what the hell we're doing and how to label it and how much THC affects you for different reasons, and the kind of THC that it is, resin versus non-resin. There's a whole, the strands, the strains, everything. There's just a ton of research that we need to do. Can't do that until we deschedule it. So there's this whole process that I'm racking my brain to get us to do it and get it over with and done.
Let's go to the audience. We've got one right up front.
I just want to say I'm from South Carolina, and I've been following you, and I watched the entire debate on the Senate floor for the medical cannabis.
Awesome.
So every day, I was there like 10 hours a day watching.
Where in South Carolina are you from? Greenville.
And
Okay.
I'm planning to open, I read, all the regulations. I'm planning to open what they're going to call a therapeutic cannabis pharmacy.
Awesome.
I'm planning to open one. I'm certified in medical cannabis, and last year I just got my Dagier certification.
Excellent. Congratulations.
I have my office building, everything. But what I wanted to say was I did listen to it, and I heard so many people give worries or concerns that are so outdated. They go to the floor to debate, and they didn't even research it. And talking about like the combination of alcohol, a lot of people will stay home and won't drive drunk, and there's research on that. So you will actually have less DUI because people will smoke at home, and your body cannot overdose. You can overdose as in how you feel, but you can't, being a medical cannabis person, you can't overdose on cannabis even if it's high THC because your endocannabinoid system shuts down when it's at a absorption level.
Right,
And-
right.
And cannabis cannot affect your vital organs.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here from South Carolina. I would encourage you to, and I was a co-sponsor of the Compassionate Care Act when I was a state lawmaker. Please reach out to Senator Tom Davis. He got it through the state Senate. It's now going to go to the state House. So anybody in South Carolina, call your state lawmakers because they're twisting their arms, and you have lobbyists for certain conservative groups out there that are now anti-cannabis when just a few years ago they were paid as lobbyists to be pro-cannabis. And so it's all about who's signing the front of their check.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to cut you off, but right behind you there is a woman with a question.
I'd love
want
to
to
talk
make
to you
sure.
afterwards, but yeah.
Yeah, we can get to as many people as possible. Ma'am, what was your question? Oh, maybe it was you, sir. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Joe, traveling from Connecticut, and I really like the dialogue that you've had between the mom and pop shops trying to enter into business and trying to enter into the economic sector. But I do think you mentioned the latter of how we're seeing now monopolies or other organizations kind of preventing that and seeing these restrictions and sanctions preventing from those businesses from doing it. For example, we see some examples in the Northeast of space requirements being a major thing. Can we really expect mom and pop shops to have this easy access or transition, like this fluid transition from a place where they can get a lease to open one of these stores? Do you think this is going to add in preventing this type of culture of consumption?
So I want to restate this for people who are following online. The question is about cronyism, essentially. We have these big cannabis entities that maybe are squeezing out mom and pop shops that want to get into this space. Representative Mace, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I would say too, some of those local regulations, in fact, a lot of states that are doing this, they want social equity, right? Well, the very regulations they're instituting in their states are actually prohibiting the mom and pop shops, the minority owners from going in, different populations from going in and being able to do that because of those regulations. And so, again, I think if you regulate it at the federal level, it'll be done awful. It does need to be done at the state and local level, and it's about having advocates that get out there and having strong voices and putting a lot of pressure. And that means calling your local legislator or elected official, emailing them, but getting people to put that pressure on to do the right thing, because some of the rules that they're instituting are actually prohibiting the very people they want to have good jobs and to open businesses from actually being able to do that. And so you got to have data and show them, hey, I can't do this because of this regulation, and here I am as a business and owner-operator. And every state's done differently, and you probably have some great examples of where it's done well. But in the Northeast, you're exactly right. Some of these laws are actually prohibiting the very people they want to benefit economically from being able to do that.
Yeah, and so I'll just emphasize the point that the combination of federal prohibition, which creates all of its own barriers to the mom and pop reality, together with state variation, heavy regulation, all means that bigger players with more money, more sophistication, more background, disproportionately white venture capital has just a competitive advantage right now. Now, I think that will change over time, partially because I'm confident Representative Mace will get her bill through, and so we'll get rid of prohibition. But these are growing pains, and it's going to be a market that's going to keep evolving, right? 20 years ago, if we were in this room, you mentioned 2002, and I said, well, what craft beer are we going to have after this? People were like, what are you talking about? Like,
Right.
Sam Adams,
What does
huh?
that even
And
mean?
so
Yeah.
things are going to change in all sorts of ways. It doesn't mean we don't want to try to build the industry effectively, but I think either, and this is the concern I've had, a lot of people who advocated for legalization are now like, oh, the federal bill has to have all these sort of rules in it to make sure the big companies don't take over. We don't want there to be big pot, and it's got to work this way or that way. And I'm like, well, I don't know how it's going to work. I do know if the federal government overregulates this, it'll have the same sorts of biases that every other overregulated industry ends up having. And the organic growth that we've already seen makes me confident that we will end up with an industry that's dynamic, in part because there's so many people who care to make sure it is that way. But again, it's, I think, something that we're going to have to sort of keep an eye on. I'll have a job for a while, which is always nice as an academic.
Quick question before we go to closing thoughts.
Thank you. Mike and Jen, we are Southland Farms, a licensed micro craft weed farm in Southwest Michigan. And I also wanted to ask about the MSOs and big weed coming in, because of the larger states, I appreciate what you said, Professor, but from Illinois to New York to Florida,
how do we go about preventing big tobacco being recreated as corporate cannabis? Because I do not believe the underground market will go away until people who love growing the plants are allowed to grow them legally and sell them to the customers.
So
Corporate
let's,
cannabis grows crappy weed, and so that allows the underground market to perpetuate for the connoisseurs and the patients and people who are looking for better than crappy.
let me restate for the people online in the little time we have left. How do you prevent big cannabis in the same way we've got big tobacco?
Competition, number one, and when it does get legalized or the reforms at the federal level, having time to have it implemented so that mom and pop shops can start up and grow and thrive. But competition, the free market will be a large part of that. But even in a state like South Carolina, where you have licenses to grow hemp, I mean, that is by and large dictated by who's got the biggest wallet, who has the connection to the highest ranking elected officials in the state to be able to get on that very short list of, back when I was a state lawmaker, it was like 20 or 30 or 40, you could get on it. Those are your richest and folks that had the greatest connections. And so competition, free market is a beautiful thing.
We're out of time, but I want to give you guys an opportunity to just offer up some last thoughts. So 30 seconds. Doug, you go first.
I just want to continue to emphasize this point that it's going to be a product of how we as a society move forward effectively to turn what had been a source of tension and criminality into incredible opportunity, incredible market growth, incredible use of a plant that was given to us by whomever, and that we can, if we work together effectively. You know, this is not just the work together bipartisan. This is all of us being committed to, as this last comment highlighted, sort of elevating the consumer, who you know is going to want something other than Bud Light of weed, right? But we can't let that just sort of hope that the structures, law, culture, marketplace, will sort of do it on its own. We have to be actively involved in moving this in the direction that we want to, but I have a great confidence that we will.
And I want to thank you all for being here today. It's Nancy Mace, spelled like the pepper spray. If you want to, you can Google me and see what I'm doing on the official side and politically as well, the bills that I'm working on. I am a Republican, and I am a freshman. I've been in office for about 14 months. In my first year in office, I've passed 4 bills. I'm averaging about 1 a quarter that I pass out of committee, then I pass out of the floor of the House of Representatives, and then move on to the Senate. While I have a very conservative voting record, it's almost 100 on every conservative scorecard, I have a record of being successful in reaching across the aisle and working with Democrats on issues that I agree on. And from animal rights to pot to pets to Britney Spears, this is where I've been able, and most recently Ukraine. Congressman Ro Khanna and I worked on legislation last week that put pressure on the White House to ban Russian oil and gas imports. This is a time, this is an issue that brings the far right, the far left, everybody together on. I've done extensive polling on this, so you know, I encourage you all to call your state lawmakers, call your members of Congress, get them on the States Reform Act, and if they're unwilling to do it, educate them on the issues where they have questions. Call me. We'll work it out. We'll figure it out. But the data is out there that we need to get this done at the federal level. And the only way we can have cannabis reform at the federal level is if we have Republicans that have a seat at the table and are part of the process and building consensus, which is what I am trying to do. So I would encourage you to look up what we're doing. Contact us. We'd love your help and support and putting that pressure on members of Congress to finally get it done. And thank you for your time for being here today.
That's our panel. Thanks for being here. Thanks to you. Thanks to everyone online. Thanks to South by Southwest in lovely Austin, Texas.
Yeah.